Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Today we'll be continuing our series on Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations with our seventh read in Book 5, Chapter 2, Part 2. Chapter 2 entitled, Of the Sources of the General or Public Revenue of the Society, and Part 2 entitled, Of Taxes. Part 2 is very long, and it's broken up into several articles, which are then further broken up into several subsections. I'll let you know when we get to the end or beginning of a subsection or article. So without further ado, let's continue from our last read. Taxes upon the necessaries of life are much higher in many other countries than in Great Britain. Duties upon flour and meal when ground at the mill, and upon bread when baked at the oven, take place in many countries. In Holland, the money price of the bread consumed in towns is supposed to be doubled by means of such taxes. In lieu of a part of them, the people who live in the country pay every year so much a head according to the sort of bread they are supposed to consume. Those who consume wheaten bread pay 3 guilders 15 stivers, about 6 shillings and 9 pence halfpenny. These, and some other taxes of the same kind, by raising the price of labor, are said to have ruined the greater part of the manufactures of Holland. Similar taxes, though not quite so heavy, take place in the Milanese, in the states of Genoa, in the Duchy of Modena, in the Duchies of Parma, Placentia, and Guastalla, and in the ecclesiastical state. A French author of some note has proposed to reform the finances of his country by substituting in the room of the greater part of other taxes this most ruinous of all taxes. There is nothing so absurd, says Cicero, which has not sometimes been asserted by some philosophers. Taxes upon butcher's meat are still more common than those upon bread. It may indeed be doubted whether butcher's meat is anywhere a necessary of life. Grain and other vegetables, with the help of milk, cheese, and butter, or oil, where butter is not to be had, it is known from experience can, without any butcher's meat, afford the most plentiful, the most wholesome, the most nourishing, and the most invigorating diet. Decency nowhere requires that any man should eat butcher's meat, as it in most places requires that he should wear a linen shirt or a pair of leather shoes. Consumable commodities, whether necessaries or luxuries, may be taxed in 2 different ways. The consumer may either pay an annual sum on account of his using or consuming goods of a certain kind, or the goods may be taxed while they remain in the hands of the dealer and before they are delivered to the consumer. The consumable goods, which last a considerable time before they are consumed altogether, are most properly taxed in the one way. Those of which the consumption is either immediate or more speedy in the other. The coach tax and plate tax are examples of the former method of imposing the greater part of the other duties of excise and customs of the latter. A coach may, with good management, last 10 or 12 years. It might be taxed once for all, before it comes out of the hands of the coachmaker. But it is certainly more convenient for the buyer to pay £4 a year for the privilege of keeping a coach than to pay all at once £40 or £48 additional price to the coachmaker, or as some equivalent to what the tax is likely to cost him during the time he uses the same coach. A service of plate, in the same manner, may last more than a century. It is certainly easier for the consumer to pay 5 shillings a year for every 100 ounces of plate, near 1% of the value, than to redeem this long annuity at 5 and 20 or 30 years' purchase, which would enhance the price at least 5 and 20 or 30%. The different taxes which affect houses are certainly more conveniently paid by moderate annual payments than by a heavy tax of equal value upon the first building or sale of the house. It was the well-known proposal of Sir Matthew Decker that all commodities, even those of which the consumption is either immediate or very speedy, should be taxed in this manner, the dealer advancing nothing but the consumer paying a certain annual sum for the license to consume certain goods. The object of his scheme was to promote all the different branches of foreign trade, particularly the carrying trade, by taking away all duties upon importation and exportation, and thereby enabling the merchant to employ his whole capital and credit in the purchase of goods and the freight of ships, no part of either being diverted towards the advancing of taxes. The project, however, of taxing in this manner goods of immediate or speedy consumption seems liable to the four following very important objections. First, the tax would be more unequal, or not so well proportioned to the expense and consumption of the different contributors, as in the way in which it is commonly imposed. The taxes upon ale, wine, and spirituous liquors, which are advanced by the dealers, are finally paid by the different consumers exactly in proportion to their respective consumption. But if the tax were to be paid by purchasing a license to drink those liquors, the sober would, in proportion to his consumption, be taxed more heavily than the drunken consumer. A family which exercised great hospitality would be taxed much more lightly than one who entertained fewer guests. Secondly, this mode of taxation, by paying for an annual, half-yearly, or quarterly license to consume certain goods, would diminish very much one of the principal conveniencies of taxes upon goods of speedy consumption, the piecemeal payment. In the price of 3 pence halfpenny, which is at present paid for a pot of porter, the different taxes upon malt, hops, and beer, together with the extraordinary profit which the brewer charges for having advanced them, may perhaps amount to about 3/2%. 3/2 pence. If a workman can conveniently spare those 3/2 pence, he buys a pot of porter. If he cannot, he contents himself with a pint, and, as a penny saved is a penny got, he thus gains a farthing by his temperance. He pays the tax piecemeal, as he can afford to pay it, and when he can't afford to pay it, and every act of payment is perfectly voluntary, and what he can avoid if he chooses to do so. Thirdly, such taxes would operate less as sumptuary laws. When the license was once purchased, whether the purchaser drunk much or drunk little, his tax would be the same. Fourthly, if a workman were to pay all at once, by yearly, half-yearly, or quarterly payments, a tax would equal to what he at present pays, with little or no inconveniency, upon all the different pots and pints of porter which he drinks in any such period of time. The sum might frequently distress him very much. This mode of taxation, therefore, it seems evident, could never, without the most grievous oppression, produce a revenue nearly equal to what is derived from the present mode without any oppression. In several countries, however, commodities of an immediate or very speedy consumption are taxed in this manner. In Holland, people pay so much a head for a license to drink tea. I have already mentioned a tax upon bread, which, so far as it is consumed in farmhouse and country villages, is there levied in the same manner. The duties of excise are imposed chiefly upon goods of home produce destined for home consumption. They are imposed only upon a few sorts of goods of the most general use. There can never be any doubt either concerning the goods which are subject to those duties, or concerning the particular duty which each species of goods is subject to. They fall almost altogether upon what I call luxuries, excepting always the 4 duties above mentioned upon salt, soap, leather, candles, and, perhaps, that upon green glass. The duties of customs are much more ancient than those of excise. They seem to have been called customs as denoting customary payments which had been in use from time immemorial. They appear to have been originally considered as taxes upon the profits of merchants. During the barbarous times of feudal anarchy, merchants, like all the other inhabitants of burghs, were considered as little better than emancipated bondmen, whose persons were despised and whose gains were envied. The great nobility, who had consented that the king should tallage the profits of their own tenants, were not unwilling that he should tallage likewise that of an order of men whom it was much less their interest to protect. In those ignorant times, it was not understood that the profits of merchants are a subject not taxable directly, or that the final payment of all such taxes must fall, with a considerable overcharge, upon the consumers. The gains of alien merchants were looked upon more unfavorably than those of English merchants. It was natural, therefore, that those of the former should be taxed more heavily than those of the latter. This distinction between the duties upon aliens and those upon English merchants, which was begun from ignorance, has been continued from the spirit of monopoly, or in order to give our own merchants an advantage both in the home and in the foreign market. With this distinction, the ancient duties of customs were imposed equally upon all sorts of goods, necessaries as well as luxuries, goods exported as well as goods imported. Why should the dealers in one sort of goods, it seems to have been thought, be more favored than those in another? Or why should the merchant exporter be more favored than the merchant importer? The ancient customs were divided into three branches. The first, and perhaps the most ancient of those duties, was that upon wool and leather. It seems to have been chiefly or altogether an exportation duty. When the woolen manufacture came to be established in England, lest the king should lose any part of his customs upon wool by the exportation of woolen cloths, a like duty was imposed upon them. The other two branches were, first, a duty upon wine, which being imposed at so much a ton, was called a tonnage, and secondly, a duty upon all other goods, which, being imposed at so much a pound of their supposed value, was called a poundage. In the 47th year of Edward III, a duty of 6 pence in the pound was imposed upon all goods exported and imported, except wools, wool fells, leather, and wines, which were subject to particular duties. In the 14th of Richard III, this duty was raised to 1 shilling in the pound, but 3 years afterwards, it was again reduced to 6 pence. It was raised to 8 pence in the 2nd year of Henry IV, and in the 4th year of the same prince to 1 shilling. From this time to the 9th year of William III, this duty continued at 1 shilling in the pound. The duties of tonnage and poundage were generally granted to the king by one and the same act of Parliament, and were called the subsidy of tonnage and poundage. The subsidy of poundage having continued for so long a time at 1 shilling in the pound, or at 5%, a subsidy came in the language of the customs to denote a general duty of this kind of 5%. This subsidy, which is now called the Old Subsidy, still continues to be levied according to the Book of Rates established in the 12th of Charles II. The method of ascertaining, by a Book of Rates, the value of goods subject to this duty is said to be older than the time of James I. The new subsidy imposed by the 9th and 10th of William III was an additional 5% upon the greater part of goods. The 1/3 and the 2/3 subsidy made up between them another 5% of which they were proportionable parts. The subsidy of 1747 made a fourth 5% upon the greater part of goods, and that of 1759 a fifth upon some particular goods of some particular sorts of goods. Besides those 5 subsidies, a great variety of other duties have occasionally been imposed upon particular sorts of goods, in order sometimes to relieve the exigencies of the state, and sometimes to regulate the trade of the country according to the principles of the mercantile system. That system has come gradually more and more into fashion. The old subsidy was imposed indifferently upon exportation as well as importation. The 4 subsequent subsidies, as well as the other duties which have since been occasionally imposed upon particular sorts of goods, have, with a few exceptions, been laid altogether upon importation. The greater part of the ancient duties which had been imposed upon the exportation of the goods of home produce and manufacture have either been lightened or taken away altogether. In most cases, they have been taken away. Bounties have even been given upon the exportation of some of them. Drawbacks, too, sometimes of the whole, and in some cases, of a part of the duties which are paid upon the importation of foreign goods, have been granted upon their exportation. Only half the duties imposed by the old subsidies upon importation are drawn back upon exportation, but the whole of those imposed by the latter subsidies and other imposts are, upon the greater part of goods, drawn back in the same manner. This growing favor of exportation and discouragement of importation have suffered only a few exceptions, which chiefly concern the materials of some manufacturers. These, our merchants and manufacturers are willing should come as cheap as possible to themselves and as dear as possible to their rivals and competitors in other countries. Foreign materials are, upon this account, sometimes allowed to be imported duty-free. Spanish wool, for example, flax, and raw linen yarn. The exportation of the materials of home produce and of those which are the particular produce of our colonies has sometimes been prohibited and sometimes subjected to higher duties. The exportation of English wool has been prohibited. That of beaver skins, of beaver wool, and of gum senega has been subjected to higher taxes. Great Britain, by the conquest of Canada and Senegal, having got almost the monopoly of those commodities. That the mercantile system has not been very favorable to the revenue of the great body of the people, to the annual produce of the land and labor of the country, I have endeavored to show in the 4th book of this inquiry. It seems not to have been more favorable to the revenue of the sovereign, so far at least as that revenue depends upon the duties of customs. In consequence of that system, the importation of several sorts of goods has been prohibited altogether. This prohibition has in some cases entirely prevented, and in others has very much diminished, the importation of those commodities by reducing the importers to the necessity of smuggling. It has entirely prevented the importation of foreign woolens, and it has very much diminished that of foreign silks and velvets. In both cases, it has entirely annihilated the revenue of customs which might have been levied upon such importation. The high duties which have been imposed upon the importation of many different sorts of foreign goods, in order to discourage their consumption in Great Britain, have in many cases served only to encourage smuggling, and in all cases have reduced the revenue of the customs below what more moderate duties would have afforded. The saying of Dr. Swift, that in the arithmetic of the customs 2 and 2, instead of making 4, sometimes only one, holds perfectly true with regard to such heavy duties, which never could have been imposed had not the mercantile system taught us, in many cases, to employ taxation as an instrument not of revenue, but of monopoly. The bounties which are sometimes given upon the exportation of home produce and manufactures, and the drawbacks which are paid upon the re-exportation of the greater part of foreign goods, have given occasion to many frauds, and to a species of smuggling more destructive of the public revenue than any other. In order to obtain bounty or drawback, the goods, it is well known, are sometimes shipped and sent to sea, but soon afterwards clandestinely relanded in some other part of that country. The defalcation of the revenue of customs occasioned by bounties and drawbacks, of which a great part are obtained fraudulently, is very great. The gross produce of the customs in the year which ended in the 5th of January 1755 amounted to 5,068,000 pounds. The bounties which were paid out of this revenue, though in that year there was no bounty upon corn, amounted to 167,800 pounds. The drawbacks which were paid upon debentures and certificates to 2,156,800 pounds. Bounties and drawbacks together amounted to 2,324,600 pounds. In consequence of these deductions, the revenue of the customs amounted only to 2,743,400 pounds, from which, deducting 287,900 pounds for the expense of management and salaries and other incidents, the neat revenue of the customs for that year comes out to be 2,455,500 pounds. The expense of management amounts in this manner to between 5 and 6% upon the gross revenue of the customs, and is something more than 10% upon what remains of that revenue, after deducting what is paid away in bounties and drawbacks. Heavy duties being imposed upon almost all goods imported, our merchants importer smuggle as much, and make entry of as little as they can. Our merchant exporters, on the contrary, make entry of more than they export, sometimes out of vanity, and to pass for great dealers in goods which pay no duty, and sometimes to gain a bounty or drawback. Our exports, in consequence of these different frauds, appear upon the custom house books greatly to overbalance our imports, to the unspeakable comfort of those politicians who measure the national prosperity by what they call the balance of trade. All goods imported, unless particularly exempted, and such exemptions are not very numerous, are liable to some duties of customs. If any goods are imported not mentioned in the Book of Rates, they are taxed at 9 shillings 9 9/20 pence for every 20 shillings value, according to the oath of the importer, that is, nearly at 5 subsidies, or 5 poundage duties. The Book of Rates is extremely comprehensive, and enumerates a great variety of articles, many of them little used, and therefore not well known. It is upon this account frequently uncertain under what article a particular sort of goods ought to be classed, and consequently what duty they ought to pay. Mistakes with regard to this sometimes ruin the custom house officer, and frequently occasion much trouble, expense, and vexation to the importer. In point of perspicuity, precision, and distinctness, therefore, the duties of customs are much inferior to those of excise. In order that the greater part of the members of any society should contribute to the public revenue in proportion to their respective expense, it does not seem necessary that every single article of that expense should be taxed. The revenue which is levied by the duties of excise is supposed to fall as equally upon the contributors as that which is levied by the duties of customs, and the duties of excise are imposed upon a few articles only of the most general use and consumption. It has been the opinion of many people that, by proper management, the duties of customs might likewise, without any loss to the public revenue, and with great advantage to foreign trade, be confined to a few articles only. The foreign articles, of the most general use and consumption in Great Britain, seem at present to consist chiefly in foreign wines and brandies, and some of the productions of America and the West Indies, sugar, rum, tobacco, coconuts, etc., and in some of those of the East Indies, tea, coffee, chinaware, spiceries of all kinds, several sorts of piece goods, etc. These different articles afford, perhaps, at present, the greater part of the revenue which is drawn from the duties of customs. The taxes which at present subsist upon foreign manufactures, if you except those upon the few contained in the foregoing enumeration, have the greater part of them been imposed for the purpose not of revenue, but of monopoly, or to give our own merchants an advantage in the home market. By removing all prohibitions, and by subjecting all foreign manufactures to such moderate taxes, as it was found from experience afforded upon each article the greatest revenue to the public, our own workmen might still have a considerable advantage in the home market, and many articles, some of which at present afford no revenue to government, and others a very inconsiderable one, might afford a very great one. High taxes, sometimes by diminishing the consumption of the taxed commodities, and sometimes by encouraging smuggling, frequently afford a smaller revenue to government than what might be drawn from more moderate taxes. All right, that seems like a good place to stop. We're right about where we want to be in terms of time. So we will continue with Book 5, Chapter 2, Part 2 in our next read with Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.